Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest. The room pulsed with life, a symphony of clinking glasses and murmured laughter weaving through the sultry hum of jazz drifting from the speakers. The annual office Christmas party was in full swing, the air thick with the scent of mulled wine and the shimmer of holiday cheer. For the first time in years, I, Eleanor Hayes, a 45-year-old accountant who'd spent over a decade carving out a quiet corner in the chaos of corporate finance, let myself soften. Normally, I was the shadow in the room, aloof, composed, dodging the quicksand of office gossip with practiced ease. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the golden fairy lights danced across the towering glass windows, bathing the space in a warm, honeyed glow. Or perhaps it was the champagne, its effervescent bite loosening the iron grip I usually kept on my emotions, letting them spill just a little. I smoothed the hem of my sapphire blue dress, a bold departure from the muted grays of my usual suits, and let my gaze wander. Colleagues clustered in tight knots, their voices rising and falling like waves, sharing stories of holiday plans or chuckling over half-remembered jokes. Then my eyes snagged on him. James Grayson, my boss. At 52, he stood apart, tall and steady, his presence a quiet storm that didn't need to roar to be felt. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his sharp jawline softened by a rare, disarming smile. He had this effortless way of drawing people in, not because he was the CEO, but because when he spoke, you felt seen, like your words mattered. We'd worked together for 12 years, our exchanges always polite but clipped, tethered firmly to the safe shores of spreadsheets and deadlines. So when his hazel eyes locked onto mine from across the room, a flicker of surprise jolted through me. When he started walking toward me, that flicker flared into a spark. "Enjoying yourself, Eleanor?" His voice was smooth as velvet, casual but laced with something warmer than I expected. I lifted my glass, the champagne catching the light like liquid gold, and forced a smile, though my pulse quickened beneath my skin. "Trying to," I replied, my tone light but my throat tight. "You don't exactly scream party guy either, you know." He laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver skittering down my spine, and took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're not wrong. Usually, I show my face, shake a few hands, and slip out before the karaoke starts. But this year," he trailed off, his gaze sharpening. "It feels different." I tilted my head, curiosity tugging at me despite the sudden tightness in my chest. "Different how?" James hesitated, his fingers tightening around his glass. Then he leaned in, just enough that his voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush, brushing against my senses like a secret too heavy to hold. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I blinked, caught off guard, my heart stumbling over itself. "What is it?" He exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips, but his eyes flickered with something raw, nerves maybe, or resolve. "Not here." Before I could untangle the knot of anticipation twisting in my gut, someone shouted his name from across the room. A junior manager, waving him over with a grin. The moment shattered. James shot me a lingering look, heavy with unspoken words, then murmured an apology and stepped away. I stood there rooted, the echo of "not here" ricocheting through my mind like a pebble dropped in still water. What did he mean? What couldn't he say amid the glitter and noise? The night wore on, but my thoughts refused to settle. Every time our eyes met through the crowd, his steady gaze cutting through the haze of laughter and clinking glasses, I felt it again. That weight, that pull, something teetering on the edge of revelation. By the time I grabbed my coat, the champagne's warmth had faded, replaced by a restless hum I couldn't shake. I was halfway to the door when a hand brushed my elbow, light but deliberate. I turned, and there he was. James, his broad shoulders filling the space, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. I hesitated, the cool leather of my coat suddenly too heavy in my arms, then nodded. "Of course." He gestured toward the balcony, and I followed, the December air hitting me like a slap as we stepped outside. It bit at my bare arms, sharp and bracing, but I barely registered it. My focus narrowed to him, to the way he stood, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city lights twinkling like scattered stars. He turned to face me, and the man who commanded boardrooms with unflinching authority looked vulnerable. "I didn't mean to be so cryptic earlier," he said, his tone quieter now, laced with an edge of regret. "I just wanted to wait for the right moment." I hugged my arms around myself, the cold seeping into my bones, but it was the heat of curiosity burning in my chest that kept me anchored. "Okay, I'm listening." James ran a hand through his silver-flecked hair, exhaling a cloud of breath that hung in the air between us. Then he looked at me, not as my boss, not as the polished CEO, but as a man peeling back a layer he'd kept hidden for years. "Eleanor, I've admired you for a long time. Not just your work, though you're damn good at it, but you. The way you move through the world, so steady, so graceful, even when everything's falling apart. I never said anything because, well, I didn't think it was my place." The words landed like a punch, soft but staggering. My breath caught, trapped somewhere between shock and a strange, dawning warmth. Admired me? For years? James Grayson, the man I'd watched steer our company through storms with quiet strength, the man I'd respected from a safe, professional distance, was standing here, bearing something I'd never dared imagine. The city lights blurred in my periphery, the hum of traffic below fading to a dull roar as I tried to find my voice. "James, I faltered, my tongue clumsy against the tide of emotions swelling inside me. Surprise, disbelief, a flicker of something I couldn't name. "You don't have to say anything," he cut in, gentle but firm, stepping closer. "I didn't tell you to put you on the spot. I needed you to know." The air between us thickened, charged with a tension that wasn't uncomfortable, but electric, alive. I stood there, the cold wind tugging at my dress, but all I could feel was the heat of his confession sinking into me, thawing something I'd locked away long ago. My heart hammered, loud and insistent, as I searched his face, those steady hazel eyes, the faint lines etched by time and responsibility. He meant it, every word. "James," I managed at last, my voice softer than I intended, trembling with the weight of what I couldn't yet articulate. "I don't know what to say." He smiled, a small, crooked thing tinged with nerves, and it cracked something open in me. "You don't have to. I didn't expect you to. I just couldn't let another year slip by without being honest." Honest! That word sliced through me, sharp and clear. When had I last been honest with myself? For years, I'd buried myself in work, building walls of routine and discipline to keep my life neat, predictable. I'd noticed James before, of course I had. His kindness, his quiet charisma, the way he listened when others only pretended to. But I'd dismissed those thoughts as fleeting, irrelevant, a distraction from the life I'd chosen. Now, standing here, his words hanging between us like a fragile thread, I wondered if I'd been wrong. I exhaled, my breath visible in the frigid air, trying to steady the storm brewing inside me. "I don't know if I've ever let myself think about this." His expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his features. "I get that." The silence stretched, heavy with possibility. I glanced back through the glass doors into the ballroom. Colleagues still laughing, glasses raised, the party spinning on, oblivious to the seismic shift happening just beyond their reach. Then I looked at him again, really looked, and asked the question gnawing at me. "Why now?" James hesitated, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with the answer. Then he sighed, the sound rough with surrender. "Because I've spent years telling myself timing mattered, that I had to keep my distance, that the lines between us, boss, employee, were more important than what I felt. But tonight, watching you across that room, I couldn't ignore it anymore." His words hit me like a wave, crashing through the defenses I'd built so carefully. A gust of wind swept across the balcony, sharp and biting, and I shivered, my arms tightening around myself. Without a word, James shrugged off his coat and draped it over my shoulders. A simple, instinctive gesture that sent a jolt of warmth through me, not just from the fabric, but from him. The scent of his cologne, woodsy, faint, wrapped around me, grounding me in the moment. "I don't want to complicate your life," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, rough with sincerity. "I just needed you to know." I met his gaze, searching for a crack in his resolve, a hint of doubt, but there was none. Just an unguarded honesty that made my chest ache. And then, before I could overthink it, I smiled, a small, unsteady thing born from a place I hadn't touched in years. "I think I'd like to figure out what this means." His eyes widened, a flash of relief, or maybe hope, breaking through the calm he wore so well. "Then let's figure it out," he murmured, his voice low and steady, wrapping around me like a promise. The moment lingered, fragile and perfect, until the balcony door swung open with a burst of noise. "There you two are!" Sarah, one of the senior managers, stumbled out, her cheeks flushed from wine and her grin wide. "We're about to do the toast. Can't have the boss miss his own speech." James glanced at me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, regret maybe, or amusement. "We should head back in," I said, adjusting his coat around my shoulders, the warmth of it still clinging to me like a tether. He nodded, and we stepped back into the ballroom, the noise and light swallowing us whole. But as we parted, him to the front of the room, me slipping into the crowd, I felt it, the shift. Nothing would ever be the same. The warmth of James's coat lingered on my shoulders as we re-entered the ballroom, the air thick with the buzz of celebration. The golden glow of the fairy lights bathed the room in a festive sheen, and the jazz swelled, weaving through the chatter like a heartbeat. I slipped into the crowd, my sapphire dress brushing against the edges of colleagues' elbows, while James moved toward the front, his broad frame cutting a path with quiet authority. The noise swallowed the intimacy of the balcony, but its echo pulsed inside me, a restless, thrumming thing I couldn't shake loose. He took his place near the podium, lifting a glass as the room hushed, all eyes turning to him. I leaned against a pillar, half hidden in the throng, my champagne flute cool against my palm. Watching him now, I saw more than the CEO I'd known for years. The way he stood, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly, radiated that effortless confidence I'd always admired. But there was something else, too, the faint curve of his lips, the way his hazel eyes swept the room, pausing, just for a heartbeat, when they found mine. "To another year of success," he said, his deep voice rolling over the crowd like a tide, steady and sure. "And to the incredible people who make it possible." The room erupted in applause, glasses clinking, laughter rippling like waves. But that fleeting glance he'd thrown my way, it wasn't just part of the speech. It was a tether, a silent thread stretching back to the balcony, pulling tight against my ribs. I swallowed hard, looking away as I sipped my champagne, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. My heart thudded too loud, too fast, drowning out the music. I needed air. Muttering an excuse to no one in particular, I wove through the crowd, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I slipped into the hallway near the coat check. The noise dulled here, muffled by the heavy doors, leaving only the faint thrum of bass vibrating through the walls. I leaned against the cool plaster, closing my eyes, my breath shallow and uneven. This wasn't supposed to happen. For years, I'd kept my world neatly boxed, work in one corner, personal life in another, the lines between them drawn in thick, unyielding ink. I'd built a reputation as Eleanor Hayes, steady, unshakable, the woman who never flinched. But one whispered confession in the cold December night, and those lines blurred, leaving me adrift. "Thinking of sneaking out?" The deep voice startled me, and I opened my eyes to find James standing a few feet away, hands tucked into his pockets, his tie loosened just enough to hint at the man beneath the title. I let out a breathless laugh, pressing a hand to my chest as my pulse skittered. "Maybe." He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine, soft but piercing. "Did I make things complicated for you?" I considered that, my fingers tightening around the strap of my clutch, the leather biting into my skin. Complicated? Yes, but not in the way he might think. not with anger or regret, but with a tangle of feelings I hadn't let myself touch in years. "I don't know yet," I admitted, my voice raw, unguarded. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer, and the faintest shadow of relief softened his features. "I meant what I said out there, you know." I glanced down at the floor, the polished wood gleaming under the dim lights, and felt a flush creep up my neck. "I know." A beat of silence hung between us, heavy but not strained, a space where we both stood on the edge of something uncharted. He spoke again, his voice quieter, rougher, like he was pulling the words from somewhere deep. "I don't expect an answer right now. I just—" He exhaled, shaking his head with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I don't want to pretend anymore." Though that honesty, raw, unguarded, stirred something inside me, a flicker of recognition I couldn't ignore. I met his gaze again, and the walls I'd built trembled. "Neither do I said, the words slipping out before I could catch them, soft but steady. His expression shifted, surprise flickering in his eyes, followed by something warmer. Hope, maybe, or relief. I should have felt exposed, vulnerable, but instead there was a strange calm settling over me, like a knot unraveling after years of being pulled tight. "I should go," I said, though my feet didn't move, and I wasn't sure why I'd said it. Maybe habit, maybe fear of what came next. He didn't argue, but as I turned to leave, his hand reached for mine. A gentle, tentative touch, his fingers brushing mine like a question. "Let me call you tomorrow?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with a quiet urgency that made my breath hitch. I hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." I slipped my hand free, my skin tingling where he'd touched it, and walked toward the exit. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, sharp and biting, but it couldn't dull the warmth blooming in my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The next morning, I woke to a world that felt lighter, softer, as if the confession on that balcony had lifted a weight I hadn't known I carried. Sunlight streamed through my apartment windows, painting the hardwood floors in golden streaks, and I padded barefoot to the kitchen, my robe trailing behind me. The kettle hummed as I replayed the night in my mind, every word, every glance, the way James's voice had wrapped around me like a lifeline, his coat over my shoulders, his hand brushing mine. "Let me call you tomorrow." I'd said yes, but now, standing here with a mug of tea warming my hands, a flutter of anticipation warred with a thread of doubt. Was I ready for this? For years, I'd lived alone, content in my quiet routines. Work, books, the occasional dinner with friends. I'd convinced myself I didn't need more, that the flicker of longing I sometimes felt was just a ghost, easily dismissed. But James, his words, his presence, had cracked that facade, letting something real seep through. I paced the living room, my bare feet sinking into the rug, my mind spinning. What if this was a mistake? What if it changed everything? My job, my stability, the life I'd so carefully built. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the counter. James's name lighting up the screen. My heart lurched, a mix of nerves and excitement surging through me. I took a steadying breath and answered. "Hello?" My voice came out softer than I intended, tinged with a tremor I couldn't hide. "Eleanor." His voice was warm, steady, a balm against my frayed edges. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I smiled, leaning against the counter, the cool edge pressing into my hip. "Neither was I." He chuckled, a low, rich sound that eased the tension coiling in my chest. "Fair enough." For a moment, we didn't speak, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was full, alive with an understanding that didn't need words. Then he cleared his throat, a hint of nerves breaking through his calm. "I don't want to push you into anything, but would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere quiet. No office, no titles. Just us." My pulse quickened, but the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. That evening, I found myself at a small restaurant tucked into a quiet corner of the city, its brick walls glowing under the flicker of candlelight. The air smelled of rosemary and red wine, and the low murmur of conversation hummed around us like a cocoon. James was already there when I arrived, standing to greet me, his dark sweater softening the sharp lines of his frame. "You came," he said, a thread of relief weaving through his voice, and his smile, warm, unguarded, lit something inside me. "I did," I replied, returning his smile as he pulled out my chair. Dinner unfolded like a revelation. We didn't talk about work, no deadlines, no budgets, none of the scaffolding that had defined us for years. Instead, we traded pieces of ourselves, stories of books we'd loved, places we'd dreamed of seeing, the small, silly things that made us laugh. With every word, I felt myself unraveling, not in a way that left me bare, but in a way that felt free, like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. His laughter was deep and infectious, his questions thoughtful, his presence steady in a way that anchored me. By the time the check arrived, I knew this wasn't just curiosity or a fleeting spark. It was real, tangible, alive, a connection I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. As we stepped outside, the cool night air brushed my cheeks, crisp and sharp, but my heart felt warm, steady. James hesitated, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the faint light. "I know this is new, and I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to pretend this isn't happening." I turned to face him, my pulse calm now, certain. "Neither do I." His face softened, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. Not just admiration, but hope, bright and unguarded. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, warm and sure. The simple touch sent a quiet thrill through me, grounding me in the moment. And as we stood there, the city humming softly around us, I realized something. Sometimes the most unexpected turns in life aren't just surprises. They're the moments we've been waiting for all along, the ones that rewrite everything we thought we knew.